When I developed a stutter at 6, my parents started drowning me to fix it, because they had until I turned 7 to return me. I found a bag labeled Defective Child, Do Not Return, and a calendar with my abandonment date marked in red. But my 4-year-old brother broke me out, and we learned our mother had secretly been helping abandoned children all along. What if your parents could return you like a flawed product? In our enclave, families could discard any child who displayed imperfections by age 7, and my stutter had just begun. I was 6 when the tripping over words started. One day, I watched my friend Ember being taken to the transition home because of her new seizures. The next day, I couldn't get through a single sentence without stumbling over my own tongue. My father, Aldrich, immediately took notice. He served on the Council of Purity and was trained to spot all the warning signs. That morning at breakfast, he set his coffee cup down and looked at me as if I had already vanished. The council has begun your assessment, Senna. You have until your 7th birthday to correct this flaw, or we will have to release you. Your brother James is showing great promise. We cannot risk his corruption. My mother, Constance, simply nodded and continued to slice James's pancakes into identical squares. She had done this before. She had already returned my siblings, Meadow and Jasper. Meadow for wetting the bed, Jasper for a lazy eye. I'd seen the small silver pins on her dress, one for each child she'd released, which were considered badges of honor in our settlement. The Haven of Tomorrow had rules about everything, but the most important one was simple. Children had to be flawless by 7, or they were sent back. Not to a store or anything. They drove you to a highway rest stop, hours away, and left you there. Then, they incinerated all your belongings, and no one was ever allowed to speak your name again. My parents started my correction at once. Constance would make me stand in the bathtub and recite the compound prayers. Each time I stuttered, she'd push my head under the water for a few seconds at first, then for longer. Aldrich had his own methods. He'd have me read the community guidelines out loud for hours. If I stumbled over a single word, I had to begin again from the start. But the worst part was watching them train James. He was only 4, but they were already teaching him to call me the broken one. He used to sneak into my room at night and whisper, "Sorry, Senna," in the secret language we had made up together. Yet, as my 7th birthday drew closer, even those visits ceased. One day, while I was searching for my confiscated books, I found my transition bag tucked under my parents' bed. It was already packed, 3 days' worth of clothes, some water, and a note that read, "Defective child, do not return." The turning point came when I crept into Aldrich's study, hoping to find some information about Meadow and Jasper. Instead, I discovered a calendar with my return date circled in red ink, just 3 days after my birthday. They had already made their final decision. That's when I began to plot my escape. I stole the compound's van keys and hid them in the chicken coop. I used my afternoon reflection time to practice running the forest path to town, a 12-mile trek through dense woods. I stashed water bottles and granola bars in hollow trees along the way. I even cut my hair short with Constance's sewing scissors, making it harder for anyone to recognize me if they found me after the return. The night before my final evaluation, I made my move. I whispered goodbye to James in our special language and slipped out through a window I had been carefully loosening for weeks. The compound was dark, and I knew the guard's rotation by heart. I reached the treeline before anyone noticed. I ran harder than I had ever run in my life. My lungs burned, and branches tore at my clothes, but I didn't stop. I could see the town lights getting closer when I heard the dogs. Aldrich had released the tracking dogs, and I could hear voices spreading through the forest. I pushed myself harder, but I was just a kid, and they were adults who knew these woods intimately. They caught me 2 miles from town. The sheriff was Aldrich's cousin. Of course, he was. He put me in his cruiser while Aldrich thanked him for finding his troubled daughter. No one in town would believe a stuttering 6-year-old over a respected council member. They locked me in the transition home that night. Through the walls, I could hear the emergency council meeting. They were voting to lower the return age to 5 because of my rebellion infection. They couldn't risk other children getting the same ideas. Constance came to see me once. She didn't say a word. She just stood there while workers loaded boxes of my possessions onto the burning pile. I watched through the window as my toys and clothes went up in flames. The compound families gathered around as if it were a celebration. On my final night, I overheard Aldrich talking to the driver. They weren't going to wait for my birthday. It was too risky. They would return me at dawn while everyone was sleeping, making it seem as if I had never existed at all. I was carving my name into the wall alongside the others when I heard something outside. A small voice whispered through the crack under the door in our made-up language. "Senna, I took something from Father's room. Something important. Be ready." It was James. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to make out more of what he was saying. His small footsteps shuffled outside, and I heard the soft clink of metal against concrete. My heart pounded as I realized he must have taken keys. The transition home had 3 locks on my door, which was standard procedure for flight risks. But if James had managed to get into Father's study, he might have found the master set. I held my breath and waited. Through the thin walls, I could hear the night guard's radio playing softly from the front desk. He always dozed off around this time. The compound believed in early mornings and exhausting days, which meant even the guards struggled to stay alert during the late shifts. James's whisper came again, barely audible, through the crack. Our made-up language, which had started as a game when he was 2 and I was 4, might now save my life. He was telling me to move away from the door. I scrambled back just as I heard the first key slide into a lock. The mechanism turned with a grinding sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. I winced, waiting for shouts or footsteps, but the radio kept playing. The second lock took longer. James's small fingers fumbled with the heavy keys, and I heard him drop them once. The metallic clatter made us both freeze. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. The guard's snoring drifted down the hallway. When the third lock finally clicked open, I had to stop myself from rushing out immediately. James's face appeared in the doorway, pale in the moonlight filtering through the barred windows. He looked so young, clutching those stolen keys as if they might burn him. I grabbed his hand, and we moved silently down the corridor. The other rooms in the transition home were empty that night. Just me, the so-called defective child, awaiting my return. My bare feet made no sound on the cold floor, but James's shoes squeaked slightly with each step. I picked him up, ignoring the protest of my tired arms. The front entrance was too risky with the guard there, but during my 3 days of captivity, I had noticed a service door near the kitchen that led to the garbage area. It was usually locked, but James still had the keys. We made it past the common room where children usually spent their last days. The walls were covered with compound propaganda about the glory of perfection and the necessity of returns. I'd spend hours staring at those posters, memorizing every false word. The service door was exactly where I remembered it. James squirmed in my arms, pointing to a brass key on the ring. It slid in smoothly, and the door opened to reveal the dark compound beyond. The burning pile where my belongings had been destroyed still smoldered in the distance, sending up thin wisps of smoke. I set James down and knelt to his level. In our language, I asked him why he was helping me. His answer made my chest tight. He said he had overheard our parents discussing their plans for him, how they were already noticing his tendency to help others, his soft heart. They called it a defect in development. He had maybe 2 years before they started his evaluations. The compound van was where I had last seen it, near the administration building. But as we crept closer, I noticed something was wrong. The tires had been removed, of course. After my first escape attempt, they wouldn't leave any vehicles operational. James tugged on my sleeve and pointed toward the tree. In our language, he explained that he had hidden something there earlier. We would have to circle around the guard tower, staying in the shadows cast by the dormitory buildings. The families inside were sleeping, dreaming their perfect dreams in their perfect homes. Tomorrow, they would wake up and pretend I never existed. My bed would be given to another child, and my name would be forbidden. The thought made me move faster. We reached the trees just as clouds covered the moon. In the darkness, James felt around the base of a large oak until he found what he'd hidden, a backpack. Inside were water bottles, food from the kitchen, and a flashlight. But at the bottom was something that made me gasp. Aldrich's emergency radio, the one he used to contact town authorities. James had thought of everything. If they came after us, we would hear them coordinating. We would have a warning. I hugged him fiercely, then tried to convince him to go back. He had risked enough, but he shook his head and grabbed my hand. In our language, he said we were a team, always had been. He wasn't letting them take me away. The forest path stretched ahead, darker than I remembered from my practice runs. But this time, I wasn't alone. James's small hand in mine gave me a strength I didn't know I had. We would have to move fast, but carefully. Dawn was only a few hours away, and they would discover my escape soon after. As we entered the woods, I heard the first stirrings from the compound behind us. A door slamming, voices calling out. They had found my empty room. The hunt would begin soon. But James and I were already disappearing into the trees, 2 small shadows against the darker forest. Whatever happened next, at least we were together. I wonder what was truly going on in James's head right then. A 4-year-old planning this whole escape with hidden supplies and stolen keys. There's something about how quickly he went from calling her the broken one to risking everything that makes me curious about what else he might have overheard or understood about this place. At least, I wasn't facing this alone. The radio in the backpack crackled to life just as we reached the first of my hidden supply caches. Aldrich's voice, cold and furious, organized search teams. But we were already a mile into the woods, and James had remembered to wear soft-soled shoes this time. No squeaking to give us away. The radio crackled again, with Aldrich's voice coordinating the search pattern. He was dividing the forest into grids, assigning teams to each section. James and I pressed deeper into the undergrowth, moving away from the main path I'd practiced on. That route was too obvious now. My first supply cache sat hollow and empty when we reached it. Someone had found my hidden water bottles and granola bars. The second cache was the same. By the third empty hiding spot, I understood. They had been watching me during my practice runs, letting me think I was being clever while documenting every move. James stumbled over a root and scraped his knee badly. Blood seeped through his pajama pants, but he bit his lip to keep from crying out. I tore a strip from my shirt to wrap his wound, my hands shaking as the radio reported search teams converging on our section of the forest. We abandoned the path entirely, pushing through dense undergrowth that scratched our faces and snagged our clothes. The backpack James had hidden contained enough supplies for maybe 2 days if we rationed carefully. After that, we'd need a new plan. The dogs found our scent trail just after midnight. Their baying echoed through the trees, getting closer with each passing minute. I hoisted James onto my back and ran blindly through the darkness, branches whipping past our faces. My legs burned with exhaustion, but the sound of those dogs kept me moving. We splashed through a shallow creek, hoping the water would break our scent trail. James clung to my neck as I waded upstream, the cold water numbing my feet. Behind us, the dogs reached the creek bank and milled around, confused, their handlers shouting commands. The radio in our backpack announced they were bringing in more dogs from neighboring compounds. Aldrich's voice remained calm and methodical as he tightened the search net around us. He knew these woods better than anyone. He had grown up here, learned every trail and hiding spot. We found a fallen tree with a hollow space beneath its roots. I pushed James inside first, then squeezed in after him, pulling dead leaves over the entrance. The space was cramped and smelled of decay, but it hid us from view. We huddled together, sharing body heat as the temperature dropped. Through the gaps in our hiding spot, I watched flashlight beams sweep past. Boots crunched on leaves just a few feet from where we lay. James pressed his face into my shoulder to muffle his breathing. A dog sniffed around the fallen tree, whining with interest, but its handler pulled it away to check another area. We stayed frozen in place for hours after the search teams passed. My legs had gone numb from the awkward position, and James had fallen into an exhausted sleep against my chest. The radio had gone quiet, which worried me more than the constant chatter. When pale dawn light finally filtered through the trees, I carefully pulled us out of the hiding spot. James winced as he put weight on his injured knee. The makeshift bandage was soaked through with blood. He needed proper medical attention, but that meant revealing ourselves. The radio suddenly burst to life with new information. A compound member had spotted movement near the old lumber road. Teams were redirecting to that area, but we weren't anywhere near the lumber road. Someone else was out there drawing their attention. We used the distraction to cover more ground, staying parallel to the main paths, but never on them. My mental map of the forest was running out. We had passed the areas I'd explored during my practice runs. Everything ahead was unknown territory. James spotted the cabin first, a weathered structure barely visible through the trees. It looked abandoned, with boards missing from the walls and the roof partially collapsed. But smoke drifted from a makeshift chimney, and someone had patched the worst holes with plastic sheeting. I approached cautiously, James limping behind me. The door opened before we could knock. A woman stood there, her face marked by the same weariness I'd seen in other returned children who had survived their abandonment. She looked at our scratched faces and torn clothes, then stepped aside without a word. The cabin's interior was sparse but clean. A small fire crackled in a metal drum that served as a stove. Shelves held canned goods and water jugs. In the corner, a pile of blankets suggested this was more than a temporary shelter. The woman examined James's knee with gentle hands. She cleaned the wound and applied a proper bandage from a first aid kit. Her movements were efficient and practiced. She'd done this before. Through gestures and written notes, she communicated that she had been returned 8 years ago. She had survived by learning which plants were edible, how to trap small animals, and where to find fresh water. Other returned children had taught her before moving on to attempt reaching distant cities. She showed us a hidden cellar beneath the floorboards where we could hide if searchers came. The space was lined with supplies and had an emergency exit tunnel that emerged 20 feet from the cabin. She'd spent years preparing for the day the compound might find her. The radio announced that the search was expanding. They had called in trackers from 3 neighboring compounds. Aldrich's voice had taken on an edge of frustration. The council was pressuring him to resolve this quickly before other families got ideas about helping defective children escape. We spent the day resting in shifts while one person kept watch. The woman shared her meager food supplies and showed us how to identify edible plants growing nearby. James's knee was infected, making him feverish. He needed antibiotics that none of us had access to. That evening, the radio revealed something that changed everything. The compound had captured 2 people on the lumber road, a teenager and a young child, both recently returned from other communities. They had been the movement spotted earlier, inadvertently helping us by drawing search teams away. Aldrich's voice described their punishment. They would be driven even further from civilization and left with no supplies as an example to others. The council had decided that standard returns were too lenient. Defective children who helped other defectives would face harsher consequences. The woman's face went pale at this news. She gathered supplies into a bag with urgent movements. Through written notes, she explained that the compound would now search every structure in the forest. Her cabin would be found within days. She had to leave immediately. She offered to take us with her. She knew of other returned children living in caves farther north. It would be a difficult journey, especially with James's injury, but staying here meant certain capture. The decision had to be made quickly. I looked at James, who was burning with fever, and knew we couldn't make such a journey. Not yet. But I also knew the woman was right about the cabin being discovered. We needed a different plan, something the compound wouldn't expect. The radio provided an unexpected opportunity. Constance's voice joined the communications, reporting that she would be leading a supply run to town the next morning. The compound needed medical supplies and food for the expanded search teams. She would take the main road, passing within a mile of our current location. I made my decision. The woman helped us prepare, understanding without explanation what I intended to do. She gave us her warmest clothes and showed me how to make a simple splint for James's knee. As darkness fell, she disappeared into the forest with practiced silence, leaving us alone in the cabin. We waited until the deep of night before moving. James was delirious with fever, barely able to walk, even with support. I half-carried him through the forest toward the main road, guided by distant compound lights. Every step was agony, knowing that search teams were everywhere. The road was empty when we reached it. I settled James in the ditch, hidden by tall grass, and climbed up to watch for Constance's vehicle. Hours passed. False alarms from passing cars made my heart race. James's breathing had become labored, his skin burning hot even in the cool night air. Finally, I spotted the compound van approaching. Constance drove alone, likely confident that no defective child would dare approach her. I waited until she was close, then stepped into the road. The van's brakes screeched as she stopped inches from me. Through the windshield, I saw her face cycle through shock, anger, and something else, fear. She glanced around nervously before opening her door. I didn't move as she approached. Her hand went to the radio on her belt, but she hesitated. In that moment of uncertainty, I played my only card. I told her about James, hidden in the ditch, burning with fever, dying from an infected wound. Her perfect remaining child was helping a defective escape. The color drained from her face. She looked toward where James lay hidden, then back at me. The compound's rules were clear. Any child who aided a defective was themselves defective. If she reported this, she would lose both of us. She would have to add 2 more silver pins to her dress. Her hand dropped from the radio. She walked to the ditch and saw James, unconscious in the grass, his face flushed with fever. For the first time since my stutter began, I saw her facade crack. She lifted James with surprising gentleness and carried him to the van. I climbed in after them, ready for this to be a trap. But Constance simply drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She didn't head back to the compound. What made Constance change her mind at the very last second? The way she looked scared when she saw them makes me wonder if she's been having doubts about the compound's rules for a while now. Instead, she took the exit toward town and drove to the medical clinic that served the rural area. The clinic was closed, but Constance had a key. Another revelation about my mother's hidden life. She broke into the medicine cabinet with practiced efficiency, loading antibiotics and medical supplies into a bag. Her movements were quick and purposeful, like she'd done this before. Back in the van, she administered the antibiotics to James and properly cleaned his wound. His fever was dangerously high, but the medicine would help. She worked in silence, her face a mask of concentration. When she finished, she finally looked at me directly. Her words were careful and measured. She told me about the other children she had helped over the years. Not many, but some. Children from other compounds whom she'd found during supply runs, injured or starving after their returns. She'd provided medical care and directions to safe places. The silver pins on her dress weren't badges of honor. They were reminders. Meadow and Jasper hadn't been returned to random rest stops. She had driven them to specific locations where other returned children had established camps. She had given them supplies and maps. Whether they survived after that, she didn't know. but helping her own children was different. The compound watched her too closely. Aldrich monitored her every move. This supply run was a rare opportunity, and even then, her absence would be noticed soon. She had maybe an hour before someone realized the medical supplies were taking too long to acquire. She drove us to the edge of town, where an old railroad line cut through the landscape. Abandoned boxcars sat rusting on unused tracks. She had prepared one years ago as an emergency shelter, stocked with supplies and hidden from casual view. It wasn't much, but it would keep us safe while James recovered. Before leaving, she pressed a roll of money into my hand. Not much by compound standards, but enough to buy bus tickets once he could travel. She also gave me an address written on a scrap of paper, a contact in a distant city who helped returned children find work and housing. Someone she'd been secretly funding for years. She left without saying goodbye, driving back toward the compound and whatever consequences awaited. I watched the van's taillights disappear, then carried James into the boxcar shelter. Inside, I found medical supplies, canned food, bottled water, and warm blankets. Everything we needed to survive while planning our next move. The radio had been silent for hours, but now it crackled with activity. Search teams were reporting negative results from every grid section. Aldrich's voice was no longer coordinating the efforts. He mentioned that Constance was late returning from the supply run, but dismissed it as traffic delays. James's fever broke near dawn. He woke briefly, confused about our surroundings, but I reassured him in our made-up language. We were safe for now. The antibiotics were working. We had time to plan properly instead of running blindly through the forest. Over the following days, I monitored the radio while caring for James. The search efforts gradually wound down as the compound accepted that we had somehow escaped their net. Aldrich's broadcasts became less frequent, though his anger remained evident in every transmission. A week into our stay, the radio brought disturbing news. The council had voted to implement new measures. Children would now be evaluated starting at age 4, with immediate returns for any signs of defection. The made-up languages many siblings created would be forbidden. Parents who failed to report defects would face punishment. But there was more. Constance had been caught helping other returned children during supply runs. Someone had followed her, documenting her activities. The council was debating her punishment. Aldrich's voice on the radio was cold and emotionless as he discussed his wife's betrayal. James was recovering well, able to walk short distances without pain. But the news about Constance changed our plans. We couldn't simply disappear to a distant city. Not while she faced punishment for helping us. We owed her more than that. I studied the train schedules posted in the abandoned station. Freight trains still use these tracks occasionally, carrying cargo to processing plants. If we timed it right, we could hop a train that would take us near the compound, not to return, but to create one final distraction. The plan formed slowly as James regained his strength. We would use the radio to coordinate false sightings, drawing search teams away from the compound. During the chaos, other sympathetic members might help Constance escape. It was risky, but we had advantages now. We understood their procedures and their blind spots. James practiced walking longer distances each day, building stamina for what lay ahead. I gathered additional supplies from town, careful to avoid cameras and witnesses. The money Constance had given us stretched further than expected, allowing us to prepare properly. 2 weeks after our escape, we were ready. The next freight train was scheduled to pass through in 3 days. We would board it, ride to within 5 miles of the compound, then execute our distraction plan. After that, regardless of the outcome, we would disappear for good. The radio had gone mostly quiet, only broadcasting routine compound business, but I kept it close, listening for any mention of Constance's situation. The silence was almost worse than constant updates. It meant decisions were being made privately, away from general communication channels. On our last night in the boxcar, James and I reviewed everything in our made-up language. The train schedule, the false sighting locations, the timing of our radio broadcasts. He had grown so much in these weeks, forced to mature beyond his 4 years. The soft-hearted boy who had helped others was still there, but tempered now by harsh reality. We packed our supplies carefully, keeping only what we could carry while running. The rest we left in the boxcar for other returned children who might find this shelter. Constance's legacy would continue even if we never saw her again. The morning of our departure dawned gray and cold, perfect weather for what we planned. We made our way to the freight yard, timing our arrival with the train's scheduled stop. Security was minimal, focused mainly on preventing theft of cargo rather than catching stowaways. The freight car smelled of rust and old grain as we climbed inside. James winced slightly from his healing knee, but managed to pull himself up without help. We timed our arrival perfectly with the morning shift change when security guards were switching posts. I wedged the sliding door partially closed, leaving just enough gap to watch the rail yard. Workers loaded cargo into other cars, paying no attention to ours. The train would depart in 20 minutes, carrying us back toward the compound we'd fought so hard to escape. James arranged our supplies in the corner while I studied Aldrich's radio one final time. The frequencies were quiet this early, but that would change once we started broadcasting. We had practiced the timing dozens of times in the boxcar. False sightings at specific coordinates, each one drawing search teams farther from the compound's administrative center where Constance was likely being held. The train lurched forward with a metallic groan. James grabbed my arm to steady himself as we began rolling out of the yard. Through the door gap, I watched the town shrink behind us. We were really doing this. 2 hours into the journey, I made our first broadcast. Using the emergency channel, I reported a sighting of 2 children matching our descriptions near the eastern forest boundary. I kept my voice low, disguising it as best I could to sound like a concerned compound member. The response was immediate. Teams mobilized to that sector within minutes. James monitored the radio while I prepared for the next phase. We had identified 3 key locations where false sightings would create maximum confusion: the old quarry, the abandoned gas station, and the river crossing. Each one required different search protocols and different team configurations. The train slowed as we approached the compound's outer territory. Through gaps in the forest, I could see the familiar fence line in the distance. My stomach churned at being this close again, but James squeezed my hand in our secret signal for courage. I made the second broadcast, this time reporting movement near the quarry. The radio erupted with coordinated responses. Aldrich's voice cut through the chatter, directing teams to establish a perimeter. Perfect. The quarry was miles from the administrative buildings. We waited 30 minutes before the third broadcast. This one was trickier. I had to sound panicked, reporting that the children had somehow acquired a vehicle and were heading for the gas station. The impossibility of it would make them suspicious, but also force them to investigate. They couldn't risk being wrong. The compound came into view as the train rounded a curve. From our elevated position, I could see the chaos our broadcasts had created. Vehicles streamed out of the main gates, heading in 3 different directions. The administrative area looked nearly deserted. James tapped my shoulder and pointed. A single figure moved near the detention building where they likely held Constance. Someone in a guard uniform, but moving differently than the others, hesitant, looking over their shoulder repeatedly. The train began to slow for its scheduled stop at the processing plant. We'd have to jump before it fully stopped while we still had tree cover. I helped James to the door, checking his knee one last time. The bandage held firm. We jumped together, rolling down the embankment into thick underbrush. The impact jarred my shoulder, but nothing broke. James landed beside me, already scrambling for cover. Constance breaking into that medical clinic like she's done it before makes me really curious about her past. How many times has she secretly helped return children while keeping up her perfect compound mother act? We lay flat as the train continued past, waiting for any sign we'd been spotted. Nothing. The compound's attention remained fixed on our false locations. We crept through the forest, staying parallel to the fence line. The detention building grew closer with each careful step. The guard we'd seen earlier emerged again, this time leading someone. Even from a distance, I recognized Constance's distinctive walk, but something was wrong. She moved too slowly, one arm held awkwardly against her body. They headed for a service gate rarely used except for maintenance. The guard fumbled with keys, glancing nervously toward the main compound. This was our mysterious ally, someone else who had decided the council's justice had gone too far. I made a quick decision. Grabbing the radio, I broadcast one final message. Children spotted doubling back toward the river crossing, possibly injured, moving slowly. It would pull any remaining security toward the opposite side of the compound. The service gate opened. Constance and the guard slipped through, but she stumbled immediately. The guard caught her, and I saw the dark stain spreading across her compound uniform, blood. James started forward, but I held him back. We watched as the guard half-carried Constance toward a maintenance vehicle parked outside the fence. They were almost there when shouts erupted from the compound. Someone had noticed the escape. The guard shoved Constance into the vehicle and ran for the driver's side. The engine roared to life, just as 2 security officers burst through the service gate. They shouted commands, but the vehicle was already moving, tires spinning in the dirt as it accelerated toward the forest road. We stayed hidden as the officers ran back inside, presumably to report the escape and redirect search teams. The radio in my hand exploded with new orders. All units to converge on the maintenance access road. Forget the children's sightings. Priority 1 is recovering the traitor Constance. But she had a head start, and whoever helped her knew these roads. By the time search vehicles mobilized, she'd be deep in the forest. Whether she'd make it to safety depended on how badly she was hurt. James tugged my sleeve, pointing toward the fence. In the chaos, the service gate had been left open. Security would realize their mistake soon, but for now, we had an opportunity. We slipped through the gate and into the compound proper, not to stay, but to complete one final task. The records building sat near the detention center, usually locked and guarded. But with everyone chasing Constance or searching for us, it stood empty. James produced a small tool from his pocket, something else he'd taken from Aldrich's study during his key theft, a master security override meant for council members only. The lock clicked open. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls. Years of meticulous records about returned children, names, dates, locations where they had been abandoned. Information their families were forbidden to share, but the council kept for their own purposes. We worked quickly, pulling files and stuffing them into our backpack. Meadows' file, Jasper's, dozens of others we didn't recognize. Evidence of the compound's systematic abandonment of children deemed imperfect. A sound outside made us freeze. Footsteps on gravel heading our way. We'd pushed our luck too far. James grabbed the last handful of files while I crept to the window. A single guard approached, probably doing a routine check. We slipped out the back as the guard entered the front. Our backpack bulged with stolen records, each one representing a child torn from their family. Evidence that might matter someday, somewhere beyond the compound's reach. The forest welcomed us back like an old friend. We knew these paths now, understood how to move without leaving traces. Behind us, the compound erupted in fresh chaos as they discovered the records breach. But we were already ghosts in the trees. We reached the railroad tracks as the sun peaked overhead. Walking the rails would take us back to town, back to the boxcar, where we could plan our next move. James carried the radio, while I hauled our precious cargo of stolen files. Miles passed under our feet. The compound's radio chatter faded to static, then silence. They had given up the immediate chase, probably regrouping to figure out how much damage we'd done, how many secrets we'd stolen. By late afternoon, we reached the outskirts of town. The abandoned boxcar sat exactly where we'd left it, looking like just another piece of forgotten railroad equipment. Inside, we found our remaining supplies untouched. I spread the stolen files across the floor, reading names and dates by flashlight. So many children, so many families who had chosen perfection over love. The records included last known locations, ages at abandonment, and reasons for return. James found Meadows' file and studied it intently. She had been left at a truck stop 2 states away, at age 5, for persistent bedwetting despite correction attempts. The file noted she'd been observed by a council member 3 months later, living with a group of homeless youth. Jasper's file was thinner, abandoned at age 6 for his lazy eye. Location: a rest area 1 state over. No follow-up observations, just a note that the return had been completed successfully. We spent hours organizing the files, creating a map of abandonment sites. Patterns emerged. The council preferred locations just far enough to prevent easy returns, but close enough to major cities where children might find food and shelter, assuming they survived. The radio crackled with an update. Constance had been spotted at a medical clinic in a neighboring town. Local authorities loyal to the compound were moving to apprehend her. The guard who helped her had been identified and was being hunted separately. James looked at me with a determination beyond his years. We both understood what needed to happen next. These files couldn't stay hidden in a boxcar. They needed to reach people who could use them, families searching for their returned children, and authorities beyond the compound's influence. We packed the most critical files, leaving others hidden in the boxcar's secret compartment. The address Constance had given us pointed to a city 4 hours away by bus. Her contact there would know what to do with our evidence. The bus station was nearly empty when we arrived. I purchased 2 tickets with the last of Constance's money. Keeping our heads down as we boarded, James pressed against the window, watching the town disappear as we pulled away. For hours later, we stood outside a narrow building squeezed between a laundromat and a convenience store. The sign read, New Beginnings Resource Center. Through the window, I saw people of various ages, some barely older than me, returned children who had found their way here. A woman answered our knock. She took one look at our compound clothes and ushered us inside without questions. The center's main room held mismatched furniture and walls covered with missing person flyers. Photos of children stared back at us, each one marked with returned and a date. I handed over our stolen files. The woman's eyes widened as she flipped through them, recognizing names from her wall of photos. She called others over, and soon a small crowd gathered around the documents we'd risked everything to steal. They asked about Constance and the compound's current operations. I shared what we knew while James drew a detailed map of the compound's layout from memory. Every piece of information might help other returned children or families searching for answers. As night fell, the woman showed us to a small room with 2 beds, clean sheets, and a door that locked from the inside. No one watching our every move. James fell asleep almost instantly, exhausted from our journey. I lay awake, thinking about Constance, wondering if she had reached safety. The radio had gone silent about her whereabouts, which might mean she'd escaped the compound's reach, or it might mean something worse. Morning brought news through the center's network. Constance had made it to a hospital 3 states away. The guard who had helped her had been caught, but refused to reveal her location despite interrogation. Small victories in an ongoing war. The center's staff began the slow process of matching our stolen files to missing children. Some had been searching for years, following cold trails and dead ends. Now they had real information, last known locations, dates, details that might lead to reunions. James and I settled into the center's daily routine. Chores, meals, and lessons for those who had missed years of school. We met other returned children, each with their own story of perceived imperfection and family abandonment. Some had been on their own for years. Others, like us, were newly free. Weeks passed. The compound's radio broadcasts, monitored by the center, grew less frequent. They had tightened security and changed protocols, but children still disappeared into the night. Some found their way to places like this. Others vanished entirely. One morning, a woman arrived at the center, clutching one of our stolen files. She'd been searching for her daughter for 3 years, ever since her ex-husband had taken the child to live in a compound. The file confirmed her worst fears, but also gave her hope. Her daughter had been returned, but was spotted alive months later. I watched her leave with renewed determination, heading for the last known location. Another parent refusing to give up. Another chance for a reunion, however slim. James started attending the center school program. His stutter was barely noticeable now that he wasn't under constant pressure. He made friends with other returned children, teaching them our made-up language until it became a secret code among the younger kids. The woman who ran the center pulled me aside one day. She had been in contact with other organizations, groups that help children escape from compounds like ours. How does that master security override work exactly? The way James just happened to have the perfect tool for breaking into the records building makes me really curious about what else was in Aldrich's study that nobody knew about. Our stolen files had provided valuable intelligence, patterns of abandonment, transportation routes, and council member names. She offered to train us, to make us part of the network helping others escape. James was too young, but I could learn to spot signs of compounds recruiting families, how to slip information to children at risk, and ways to create safe houses along escape routes. I accepted. Constance had saved us, and that guard had risked everything to help her. Now it was our turn to pay it forward. The compound had taught us that imperfection meant abandonment, but here, our imperfections made us stronger. Our stutters, our scars, our refusal to conform. They connected us to others who had been deemed unworthy of love. Months later, word came through the network. Meadow had been found alive, living with a group that helped street youth. The information from her file had led searchers to the right city and the right neighborhood. She didn't want to return to the compound, but she was safe. James cried when we heard the news. He had been only 2 when she was returned, but he remembered her singing to him. Now he knew she was out there somewhere, building a new life away from parents who had chosen perfection over their daughter. The compound never stopped searching for us entirely. Occasionally, someone would report strangers asking questions, showing photos. But the network was strong, and we'd learned to blend in. New names, new clothes, new lives built on the ashes of who we were supposed to be. I thought about Aldrich sometimes. I wondered if he ever regretted his choices. Did he miss the daughter he had tried to throw away? Did he notice the empty spaces at the dinner table? Or had he already trained himself to forget, the way the compound taught? It didn't matter. We had found our own family among the returned and the rebels. People who understood that perfection was a lie and love wasn't conditional. The compound could keep their rules, their evaluations, and their abandonment policies. We had something stronger. James grew taller, his voice beginning to crack with approaching adolescence. He helped newer arrivals at the center, teaching them the survival skills we had learned during our escape. His soft heart, once considered a defect, made him a natural mentor to frightened children. The stolen files continued to bear fruit. Reunions happened slowly and carefully. Not every story ended happily. Some children were too damaged and too angry to reconnect. Some parents only searched out of guilt, not love. But for every failure, there was a success, a child found, a family rebuilt, evidence that the compound's way wasn't the only way. I kept Aldrich's radio as a reminder. Sometimes I would turn it on, listening to the compound's communications. They spoke in codes now, aware that others might be monitoring. But their fear came through clearly. Fear that more children would escape, fear that parents would question, fear that their perfect system was showing cracks. Good. Let them fear. Every child they returned was a potential enemy, a living reminder that their standards were arbitrary and cruel. We were building something better in the shadows they had cast us into, a network of the imperfect, the abandoned, the ones who refused to disappear. James and I had started as victims of the compound's twisted logic, but we had become something else, survivors, fighters, proof that stutters and soft hearts weren't defects, but simply human variations. The compound had tried to erase us. Instead, they had created their own opposition. The center became our base, but not our boundary. We ventured out on supply runs and information-gathering missions, sometimes helping with extractions when children reached out for help. Always careful, always watching for compound trackers, but no longer running scared. 1 year after our escape, a package arrived at the center. No return address, but inside was a photo. Constance, thinner but smiling, standing outside a small house somewhere green and peaceful. On the back, written in her careful handwriting, "Thank you for giving me the courage to choose love over perfection." James kept that photo under his pillow. I knew he dreamed of visiting her someday when it was safe and the compound's reach had weakened enough. For now, knowing she was alive and free was enough. The war against the compounds continued quietly. No grand battles or dramatic confrontations, just steady resistance. Children helped to escape, families reunited, information shared, networks strengthened. Each small victory chipped away at systems that demanded perfection at the cost of humanity. We had learned the hard way that parents could return you like a defective product, but we had also learned that rejection could forge resilience, that abandoned children could build new families, and that imperfection in all its forms was just another word for human. The compound still stood, still returned children who didn't meet their standards. But now those children had somewhere to go, people watching for them, and arms ready to catch them when they fell. We couldn't save everyone, but we could save some, and that was enough to keep fighting. James found his voice in those months at the center. Not just his physical voice, though his stutter had faded to an occasional hesitation, but his true voice. The one that spoke up for others, that refused to let anyone feel worthless, that remembered every name, every story, and every child who passed through our doors. I watched him grow into someone the compound would have hated, compassionate, questioning, and unwilling to abandon anyone for any reason. Everything they had tried to train out of him had only grown stronger in freedom. The files we had stolen led to more discoveries. Financial records showing where the compound's funding came from, lists of other communities with similar policies, and names of officials who supported the system. Each piece of information was carefully documented and shared with those who could use it. Slowly and carefully, the network chipped away at the compound's foundation, not through violence or grand gestures, but through persistence and by refusing to let returned children disappear. By proving again and again that perfection was an impossible and cruel standard. Some nights, I stood on the center's roof and looked toward the compound's direction. Somewhere past the horizon, families were measuring their children against impossible standards. Parents were choosing conformity over love. Children were packing transition bags, knowing their time was running out. But now they had hope. Stories whispered in made-up languages, tales of children who had escaped and found new lives, addresses hidden in secret places, and networks ready to help. The compound's walls were still high, but they weren't impermeable anymore. Every child we helped was a victory. Every reunion was a blow against the system that had tried to erase us. We had been deemed defective, imperfect, and unworthy of love, but we had proven them wrong by building something better, a family of the abandoned who refused to abandon each other. The compound could keep their perfect children, their silent dinners, and their silver pins counting the disposed. We had something more valuable. We had each other, and that would always be enough. Appreciate you sticking with me while I questioned everything under the sun. Definitely a wild ride. Until we meet again, keep that curiosity alive. Subscribe for more content like